Good afternoon and welcome to Wednesday afternoon with LM Montgomery as we continue with our story time with LM Montgomery, reading stories that were written by LM Montgomery and published in the year 1900. So the story we're going to do today, we're reading it in parts, and it's called The Courtship of Sherman Craig. And so it's an account of Mrs. Lucinda Moore's self-sacrifice. So reading the various parts, Roger Moore is our narrator, Paul Burleigh is Sherman Craig, Barb Burleigh is Lucinda Moore, and Samantha Thomson is Bessie Moore, Mrs. Lucinda's daughter. And there's a couple of other small minor parts that will be filled in the background. Okay.
Mrs. Lucinda Moore looked up from the pies she was making out through the window to the buggy that had just stopped at her gate. Mrs. Lucinda frowned. A young girl with rosy oval face and very bright dark eyes had just sprung out and was tripping up the garden path between the sweet pea trellises, while the driver of the buggy, a fine-looking man of middle age, lifted his hat politely and turned his spirited horse.
That makes the 8th or 9th time that Sherman Craig has driven Bessie home from her music lesson,
said Mrs. Lucinda to herself.
and I don't like it. Bessie says he just happens along and picks her up. It's queer he happens along so regular. Men like Sherman Craig haven't time to always be on the road just by accident. And he was here 2 nights last week. I hate to think it, but I do really believe he is trying to court Bessie, and that she more than half likes it. But if 'tis so, I'm not going to allow it. I won't have Bessie marrying a man old enough to be her father. Why, Sherman Craig must be as old as I am, but a man is never too old to make a fool of himself.
Bessie Moore was at the door now, so Mrs. Lucinda gave up talking to herself and smoothed her frowns out. She was a slender, pretty woman who did not look her 40 years, for she had kept her fresh color and smiling dark eyes along with the brisk, energetic ways of her girlhood.
Bessie,
She said sharply as the girl came in.
wasn't that Sherman Craig who brought you home just now?
Yes, Ma.
Bessie spoke in the soft, sweet drawl she had inherited from her father.
He picked me up by the bridge.
He's got into a habit of picking you up, it seems to me.
Said her mother dryly.
Now, don't you go encouraging him, Bessie. He's too old for you, and I won't allow it, and I may as well tell you in time.
Bessie looked up with an expression that was lost on her mother, who was crimping the edges of her pies. Presently, a roguish look came into her eyes, and the dimpled corners of her mouth twitched.
Why, Ma, I'm sure Mr. Craig is a very nice man. I've heard you say so yourself.
He's nice enough. I always did like Sherman Craig. In his place. But his place isn't as your beau, Bessie. Though that's what he's after, as plain as can be. Now you mind what I say. Just give Sherman Craig a gentle hint that he needn't parade the bridge road in that new buggy for your sake, or I shall have to do it myself.
I like Mr. Craig,
Said Bessie boldly.
and I'm sure it's very kind of him to drive me home. I shan't give him any hints, Ma. I'm sure I like talking to him ever so much better than to the young minister.
Bessie whisked out of the kitchen, and Mrs. Lucinda sighed.
I know I'm going to have trouble with those 2. I can just feel it in my bones. Sherman Craig is kind of fascinating, and Bessie'll go and fall in love with him like as not. But I'll do my best to prevent, though. Sherman Craig has got to reckon with me.
And Mrs. Lucinda shut the oven door on her pies with a firmness that betokened breakers ahead for Mr. Craig. Mrs. Lucinda had been a widow for so long that people had almost forgotten that she had been anything else. Bessie was her only child, and the mother was very proud of her. Mrs. Lucinda knew that Bessie was counted the prettiest girl in Jordan, and she was ambitious for her. The young Methodist minister who had lately come to the circuit was a nice, clever, bashful young fellow, and evidently admired Bessie. Mrs. Lucinda looked upon him with favor, but Bessie was wayward. She declared that the minister frightened her, he was so painfully good. And now she seemed bent on flirting with Sherman Craig. Mrs. Lucinda felt aggrieved. Girls were such contrary creatures.
I wish she wasn't too big to shut up. But she is, and wishes won't do any good. I shall have to be most awful careful. Bessie, a Moor to the backbone, and every one of the Moors is just like a pig. If you try to drive it one way, it'll bolt the other. And if I let Bessie see that I'm too dead set against Sherman, she's capable of taking a notion to him out of sheer contrariness and sticking to it. I almost wish that minister wasn't quite so pious. He'd stand a better chance with her if he were a mite more, well, worldly.
The next night, Sherman Craig walked home with them from prayer meeting. Mrs. Lucinda was on the outside of the street, so he came up by her, and she talked to him all the way home as a means of shutting Bessie out of the conversation. When they got home, she bade him good night and marched Bessie uncompromisingly in, although he seemed disposed to linger.
I managed that pretty cleverly,
she reflected after Bessie had gone silently upstairs.
I suppose Sherman will think I'm a terrible old tartar, but I don't care. He shan't have Bessie, a man that was beauing young girls around when I was married. He is certainly fine looking. I must say, I do like handsome men. That poor minister isn't much to look at for all he's so clever.
When Sherman Craig came boldly down the next night, Mrs. Lucinda felt greatly perplexed. She could not snub nor insult the man. He had been her friend when she needed friends badly. In the lawsuits and troubles that had followed her too easygoing husband's death, Sherman Craig had been a tower of strength to her. Indeed, it was owing to him that she and Bessie had anything at all left to live on. Since then, he had been of assistance to her in many ways. The very house they lived in was his, and he let them have it for an almost nominal rent. Under such circumstances, what was Mrs. Lucinda to do? She tried to be cool to him, but as her coolness was warmer than many a woman's cordiality, the unwelcome suitor was not chilled. He had brought a book for Bessie, and a dozen fine apples from his famous graft for her mother. Mrs. Lucinda had a weakness for apples, and would have been an easy victim to the serpent of Eden. She had to eat some, and they mellowed her attitude greatly, but she would not go out of the room and leave Sherman and Bessie alone, as she would have done in the minister's case. She sat the long autumn evening squarely out, while Sherman and Bessie played parcheesi. He had asked her to play too, but she refused. When Bessie went out to get lunch, Sherman came over and sat down near her.
He wants to get on good terms with his mother-in-law,
She thought, and laughed grimly inwardly. Outwardly, the laughter betrayed itself in an almost girlish sparkle of her eyes and a pucker of her red mouth.
You look as young as you ever did, Lucinda.
Said Sherman admiringly. Mrs. Lucinda flashed a sharp look at him over her knitting.
"Oh, no, I don't, Sherman. And I'm not as young as I used to be. And neither are you. We are both getting old."
She smiled maliciously. He watched her flying needles and nodded gravely.
Yes, that's a fact, Lucinda. But I feel young enough at heart yet. Almost as much of a boy as ever.
Doesn't seem to mind my slur about his age a mite.
She thought.
I have supposed he'd be kind of sensitive on that point when he's trying to court a girl young enough to be his daughter. But Sherman Craig never was like anybody else. He is nice, and I hate to be so snippy with him, but why can't he just have some sense?
When he went away, Mrs. Lucinda showed him to the door.
There isn't going to be any lingering about on the step.
She said to herself, and her own good night was brief enough. Bessie leaned over the banister when her mother came back through the chilly little entry.
Isn't Mr. Craig a lovely, Ma?
She asked, with an expression compounded of innocence and impishness.
I do think he's the very nicest man I know.
Bessie Moore,
Returned her mother sternly.
you do talk like a born fool. Go to your bed straight off.
A week afterward, Sherman Craig asked Mrs. Lucinda and Bessie to go with him to the church sociable at Whiteside. Mrs. Lucinda had to go, for Bessie was bent on it, and her mother was determined not to let her go alone. The significant looks cast at them angered the older woman. No doubt people were beginning to talk about Sherman and Bessie. The very fact of his bringing them there would lead others to suppose she approved of it. Later on, she overheard old Mrs. Rux say to Annetta Flat,
Sherman Craig means business, I tell ye. That'll be a match yet. Who'd have thought it? Wonder what Bessie thinks of it.
She thinks it all right, I guess.
Miss Flat's voice was acrid. She had a weakness for Sherman herself.
Maybe she'll be wiser by and by. Young girls nowadays are so silly.
Dear me, this is dreadful.
Wailed Mrs. Lucinda in the solitude of her own reflections.
I had no idea people were taking so much notice. What on earth am I going to do? I can't insult the man. He won't take hints. It'll end by Bessie taking him yet, in spite of me. And that will just about finish me off. She wouldn't be happy with him. They're not a bit suited to each other, even if they were more of an age.
But, in spite of the evident unsuitability, Sherman Craig kept walking home with Bessie and her mother from prayer meeting and calling twice a week. And Bessie dressed in her best the nights he came and grew rosier and prettier every day. Mrs. Lucinda carried out her plan of campaign cleverly. Sherman Craig never saw Bessie alone when he called, and Mrs. Lucinda even took to playing parcheesi with him to keep her daughter out of it. She tried to play off the young minister against him too, but this failed. Bessie would have none of him, and Sherman evidently considered him a nice boy of no particular importance, and seemed to have no idea of feeling jealous. In spite of all her strategy, Mrs. Lucinda felt that she was being baffled.
I can't keep this up forever.
She groaned.
I suppose I might just as well give in first as last. I believe I hate Sherman Craig. He spoiled all the plans I'd made for Bessie. If that child sets her mind on marrying him, I shall have to give in, for I can't bear to make her unhappy. But it's dreadfully against my judgment.
One night, Bessie came home from a neighbor's house after dark. Her eyes were sparkling, and her cheeks were red.
Ma, I saw Mr. Craig tonight. He told me he was coming up to see you tomorrow evening, and I think he's going to say something very particular to you. I hope, Ma, that you'll consent to what he asks.
Bessie Moore!
Mrs. Lucinda dropped her knitting in dismay.
Do you mean to tell me that matters have gone as far as that? Oh, Bessie, what on earth perverse spirit has gotten into you? I'm sure you can't care so awful much for a man as old as Sherman Craig.
Bessie's big liquid eyes overflowed with laughter.
I think a great deal of him.
She pouted.
What makes you so set against him, Ma?
He's too old for you.
Cried Mrs. Lucinda for the 20th time.
Why, child, he's just my age. I'll never be willing, Bessie. If you marry him, it'll be against my wishes, that's all.
Bessie put her hands over her face and ran out of the room. Mrs. Lucinda heard a queer, stifled sound.
There, she's crying. Well, I suppose she'll have to have him, since she's so bent on it. It does beat all. You can never tell what a Moore will do. But if I feel dreadful disappointed, Sherman will be kind to her, I haven't a doubt, and he's well-to-do and wise, but I did want Bessie to marry somebody else other than a farmer. That minister now. But there's no use thinking about that. It'll only aggravate me. This'll be the come down to Annetta flat. If that is one small comfort. She's been angling for Sherman for years. She looked as if she could bite me when I spoke to her yesterday. Goodness knows, she needn't blame me for making the match. She can't feel much worse about it than I do.
After Bessie showed Sherman Craig into the sitting room the next evening, she gave her mother a sweetly appealing look and vanished. Mrs. Lucinda's good evening was crisp and frosty in the extreme. It plainly disconcerted Sherman, and he talked constrainedly. Mrs. Lucinda noted scornfully the details of his attire. He always dressed smartly, but he had a new suit on tonight, and his hair and mustache had been carefully trimmed. He wore a white silk tie and had a chrysanthemum in his buttonhole.
Looks like a bridegroom already,
thought Mrs. Lucinda crossly. Sherman was plainly nervous, and his uncompromising vis-a-vis wouldn't help him out. After a half hour of jerky conversation, during which he had watched Mrs. Lucinda's flying needles with a fascinated eye, he came over and sat down on the sofa beside her.
Lucinda,
He said in a shaky voice.
I came up tonight to ask you a certain question.
I've a good idea what it is.
Said Mrs. Lucinda. Her tone was certainly forbidding, but Sherman brightened up visibly.
Then I might ask it?
He bent a little nearer,
I don't suppose I can prevent you.
said Mrs. Lucinda bitterly.
The thing may as well be settled now as any time. Bessie will have to have her own way, I suppose. But I won't be pretending to be willing, for I'm not. You're too old for Bessie, and you ought to have sense enough to know it.
During this speech, Sherman's face had undergone a startling variety of expressions. At the last sentence, he sprang to his feet.
Lucinda,
He gasped.
you don't mean to tell me you think it's Bessie that I've been courting all along?
Not Bessie?
Mrs. Lucinda's voice expressed the last degree of amazement.
Then who?
Why, you!
Me?
Yes, you!
Repeated Sherman energetically.
Why, Lucinda, you must have known.
I didn't.
Gasped poor Mrs. Lucinda, trying to collect her thoughts.
I thought it was Bessie you wanted. And what is more, the girl thinks so herself.
Bessie? Impossible! Why, Lucinda, she's nothing but a child compared to you. I've tried to be kind to her, so that she'd like me. But she knew it was you I came to see.
She didn't know.
Said Mrs. Lucinda firmly.
And she has taken a notion to you, Sherman Craig. Why, I tell you, she cried last night because I told her I wasn't willing for you to have her. This will break her heart.
There's something here I don't understand.
Said the poor, bewildered lover.
I'm sure Bessie couldn't have thought so. Go and ask her if you don't believe me.
So I will.
And Mrs. Lucinda marched with very red cheeks to the kitchen where Bessie was reading a book Sherman had brought her.
Bessie Moore, I want to ask you a straight question, and I want you to answer it straight. Did you think it was you, Sherman Craig, came here to see?
So you found that at last. No, indeed, Ma. I knew it was you, and so did everybody else in Jordan. You dear old goose. When you took it into your head that he was after me, I let you think so just for a joke. But I never dreamed you'd be so long in finding out the difference. It was dreadfully funny to see you sitting there every evening he came, so that he wouldn't have a chance to make love to me.
He was always driving you home from places.
Cried
Yes.
her mother.
Yes, partly to please you, and partly, I guess, get me on his side. Why, Ma, he thinks I'm a baby. He's crazy about you. Everyone says so. Last night, he gave me a pretty broad hint that he was going to say something important to you tonight, and that I was to leave the coast clear.
And Bessie, you don't want him for yourself?
I do want him very much, as a stepfather. Do go back, Ma, and put him out of his misery.
I've made an awful fool of myself.
Said Mrs. Lucinda solemnly.
Why, he thinks you know it was here. Why, he thinks you know it was you he came to see. Ma, you didn't go tell him you thought he wanted to marry me.
Yes, I did.
Mrs. Lucinda went out of the kitchen and slammed the entry door behind her.
I've never felt so mixed up in my life.
She gasped.
What a dreadful girl. But I honestly do believe that half the reason I was so set against her marrying Sherman was because I wanted him for myself. Though I never suspected it before, what on earth am I to say to him?
What does Bessie say?
Demanded her suitor impatiently as he came forward to meet her. Mrs. Lucinda looked up shyly.
She says she wants you for a stepfather.
Well,
Sherman Craig had his arms around the little woman now, and his face was very close to hers.
And She's had everything she ever wanted since she was born, if I could get it for her. And I suppose she'll have to have this too.
The Courtship of Sherman Craig by LM Montgomery.